All right, and here we are. Please let me introduce the amazing Dr. Mitzi Krockover, and she'll be giving you a welcome, and just take one more minute to fill out this poll.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Really appreciate it. As Rochelle said, I'm Dr. Mitzi Krockover, and I want to welcome all of you to our webinar on the aftershocks of the Roe v. Wade decision, or more accurately, the overturn of Roe v. Wade by way of Dobbs versus Jackson. I appreciate everyone taking time out of their day, or for those abroad, your evening, to join us. For those I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, either virtually or in person, I host a podcast, Beyond the Paper Gown, to inform women about medical conditions and also the factors that impact their health and healthcare, such as research or lack, access to care, bias in the healthcare system, and yes, policies and politics. Nowhere is this more illustrated than in current events. I, like all of you, knew this day was coming. Still, once it hit, it felt like an earthquake. And if any of you live in California or other places that experience earthquakes, you know that shortly after the first jolt, for some time, you'll experience aftershocks, most of which are much less jarring than the first initial quake, but can also be pretty sizable and unpredictable. You never quite know when they're going to hit. So I couldn't think of a better analogy for what we've all just experienced. And just like earthquakes, which are pretty indiscriminate in terms of who they affect, this decision will impact everyone to some degree, and admittedly, some more than others. But no matter our gender, sexual orientation, political affiliation, or religion, we will all be affected in some way. I moved to California in 1990, and my first earthquake experience was the 7.2 Northridge earthquake. I learned then about how to pack an earthquake kit to help survive another natural disaster. This webinar aims to provide you with the beginnings of your earthquake kit. To build an earthquake kit, you need to start with the basics. So in this case, we're going to start with information. And I am so grateful to the individuals on this panel. Each of them is a recognized expert and usually commands much more time than we could give them today. But they agreed to come together for a quick overview so that you can see the full scope of the implications of this decision all at once, the coming aftershocks, if you will. I also want to take a moment to thank my team, the webinar team that's helping us from KLM Consulting, Rochelle Poulton, who you've met, and Kellie Lorenzen, and a special and heartfelt thank you to my woman-centered and Beyond the Paper Gown team, Kyla McMillian and Ben Smith, Jackie Hine, Lee Steele, and Patrick Shambayati. And a shout out to Offscript Health Media Network, which Beyond the Paper Gown is also proud to be a part of. Now, a little housekeeping. We're going to move through this information very quickly. And so what you to know is that the Q&A is for questions for speakers and panelists, and the chat is for comments. So please be respectful. If you have technical problems, please use the chat to seek assistance. And please know that the webinar is recorded, including your questions. We will not get to everyone's question, and we do apologize in advance. You'll probably feel somewhat frustrated and that we can't go deeper in this short time, but we hope to do so in the future. Please let us know what topic you're most interested in. And as you can see here, it looks like it's pretty much across the board in terms of the interest, and we'll get back to those hopefully again in the future. We also invite you to continue the discussion on our forums at beyondthepapergown.com, and we'll also be following up by email and newsletter. So I want to bring on our first panel, and that is Kim Christensen Clark, who is now Legal Director for Legal Voice, and Heather Carter, who is Executive Vice President of the Greater Phoenix Leadership and a former Arizona State Senator and State Representative. Thank you so much for you all being here today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So Kim, I'm going to start with you. Let's go ahead and summarize that ruling and let us know what the decision was based on.
Sure. Well, let me start with Roe versus Wade. The right that was recognized in Roe versus Wade was grounded in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which basically prohibits any state from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And of course, life and property are very clear, but legal scholars have debated for a long time what this concept of liberty means. And of course, I could go on about the opinion, but in short, what the majority of the Supreme Court held was that this idea of liberty, whatever rights are conferred by this concept of liberty, are limited to those rights that existed when the 14th Amendment was drafted and passed. And of course, the problem with that, reading that form of constitutional interpretation is that it's limited in time. We're frozen in time to when the 14th Amendment was passed. And of course, more than half the population didn't enjoy equal rights at that time. And of course, there are flaws, I think, with the historical interpretation of the court's opinion as well. But that, in a nutshell, is what the court held.
I see. And so where does that leave the states, and what is the status overall at this point in time?
So unfortunately, there are 26 states that are poised to ban abortion outright. 13 have trigger bans, which are laws that were drafted before this decision was issued that basically said that if the Supreme Court were to overturn Roe versus Wade, these laws would go into effect. There are another set of states that are poised to pass similar laws. And then there are laws on the books from before Roe versus Wade was decided that many states that banned abortion, that many states are now seeking to enforce. There are also statutes like Texas SB 8, which impose civil liability or create a private cause of action that individuals can bring against providers for offering abortion care after fetal embryonic activity can be detected. And of course, that's problematic because it adds to the burden that these bans are imposing. Also, and I think you're going to get into this later on in your presentation or in the panel discussions to come, it really creates a culture of medical surveillance. It incentivizes individuals to spy on one another and literally creates a monetary reward for cybersecurity attacks and other intrusions on the individual privacy of people who can become pregnant and their providers.
And what does that mean in terms of medical complications of pregnancy?
Well, there's a huge concern. This has already been an ongoing concern, but where folks are experiencing miscarriages and they go to the hospital with complications. I'm sure that your other panelists will get into this as well. But there are many hospitals who, particularly those who follow the Catholic hospital's ethical and religious directives, that will refuse to provide care until such time as there, even where it is clear that the pregnancy is not viable, even if it's an ectopic pregnancy, until there's no fetal heartbeat, which poses significant health risks for pregnant people. It can lead to sepsis. Until now, those folks, and that happens across the country, even in so-called safe haven states. Until now, folks have gone to, would at least have the option of going from those types of hospitals to Planned Parenthood or other independent reproductive health clinics for care. But now in these states that are banning abortion, many of those clinics are closing. And so now it means potentially having to cross state lines to access that care as well at a time when you are facing a medical emergency.
Right. And I will say then we probably will, as you mentioned, get to it in our other panel, that even medical centers are talking to their faculty and their residents and saying we may not be able to provide this kind of care, which is very scary.
That's right, because the laws are very vague as to, when, care can be provided. What does it mean, for a pregnancy to pose a threat to someone's life? That is, obviously a huge problem with these statutes.
And then what other reproductive rights might also be affected?
Well, I think there are other rights in general that are at risk. There are, the right to contraception is grounded, and that is also grounded in the Liberty Clause of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, as is gay marriage, the right to sexual privacy. There are a whole range of rights that could be implicated by this decision. And while the majority said, "Oh, we're confining this decision to abortion," those rights aren't at risk. there's absolutely no principled, basis for the protection of those rights after this decision. So, there are significant consequences. You and I have also talked about IVF. A lot of these statutes, may be written broadly enough to encompass something like IVF if they prohibit the destruction of a fertilized embryo, because IVF, as we know, often results in the destruction of fertilized embryos. It really, in that case, comes down to the state statute, but certainly that's another unintended consequence of these laws.
Explain that a little bit, because I think it can get kind of confusing with respect to why is IVF even a part of this conversation?
So it involves IVF, of course. Many of these statutes define life as beginning at conception, meaning at the point at which you have a fertilized embryo. And so if it is murder if the destruction of a fertilized embryo constitutes murder, that would implicate IVF treatments potentially, as well as abortion and miscarriage management. That's, I think, that's the concern.
Right. And so then that means that those individuals may have to keep those embryos frozen or stored for a period of time, which incurs more cost. And also, I think there was also a question that they would have to use all of them all at once, thereby, having a pregnancy that could have multiple births.
Exactly. Right. And I think the real question is whether or not, providers will continue to offer, that care in states that have these abortion bans as well.
So, Heather, as we heard, the states have a lot of say in this. And I just want to, note, you were in the State House and Senate, and you chaired the Health Committee in the State House as a Republican. You ran as a Right to Life candidate, but I know you personally, and I know that you don't see things as black and white. You understand the nuances, especially when you consider all of your constituents. And we know that 82% of people in the United States want there to be access to legal and safe abortion. And again, there may be different thoughts about, at what time do you cut that off, perhaps. And we also know that there's data, and we're going to get to this again later on, about that the loss of access to abortion leads to worse health outcomes for mother and baby, and results in keeping women, especially those that are already economically challenged, and their children in poverty. So I have two questions for you, if you would. How is that kind of data or even constituent desires factored in as a House representative or senator? And then what are the challenges now once a decision is made for people like yourself who are still left in elected office, who are open to a more nuanced approach? How can they approach this issue? Do they even have a path to help craft a compromise, if you will?
Well, thank you, Mitzi, for inviting me. And I have always enjoyed being able to pick up the phone and ask you questions from a medical perspective. And I think that's what's really important to understand, is that as an elected official, we are a citizens representative body, meaning we are just as diverse in our opinions and views as the American population is. And yet we do not have all of the answers as the elected officials. And so as an elected official, I always valued being able to pick up the phone and call you and ask you questions. So I'm going to unpack your question first with sort of an overview of the way you can kind of look at the process. If you think about it, this is really about both politics and the policy. Obviously, today we're going to take a deep dive into the policy, but I want to spend just a minute discussing the politics of this issue. Because if you look at them as two separate sort of pieces of the same issue, you're never going to be successful. They are the same coin. And if you don't understand the politics, you'll never be effective in the policy world. And if you don't understand the policy, you're going to have some massive challenges around the political world as well. So it's really two sides of the same coin. So from the political standpoint, this issue of choice versus pro-life has been reduced to a dichotomous answer on a survey. You are either pro-life or you are pro-choice. And there's very little room on any surveys, endorsement, interviews that you do to have this nuanced conversation. So my challenge to the body politic is elevate this conversation. Let's have more authentic, fact-based, more robust conversations around these important issues. Because as this panel and this webinar today will show, is there are a lot of unintended consequences. So that takes me to the policy side of the coin. So, I'm really excited to be on this panel today to hear what all the experts have to say. I wish I had a crystal ball, but I don't know how this is all going to work out, not only in the near future, but in the long term. So what can we do right now? First of all, it has to be all hands on deck. So you as an expert in the field, whatever your area of expertise is, or your own personal experience as an individual, I challenge you to get involved in the process. That means know who your elected officials are. That means making sure that you're showing up and voting when it matters. What happens is a lot of these decisions on who our elected officials are happens in the primary election. Typically, the lowest voter turnout of all of the different elections. Obviously, we just came out of a very robust presidential election. There will be one coming up in 2024, but there will be hundreds of little elections leading up to that will make a fundamental difference on what happens next around these issues and all of the unintended consequences. So a big thing that we need to do is look at the policies and really take a deep dive and fix where we can make changes in statutory, in the regulatory environment to make sure that we are addressing some of these unintended consequences. And it will take all of us working together. And then Mitzi, if I may, my last point I want to make sure I get out to everybody listening today is whatever you do, please do not remain in the echo chamber. You have to talk to people that hold a different opinion than you hold. And you have to do it with respect, follow your heart, speak your truth. And that's the only way we're going to figure out the path forward for this great country. And I really encourage you to talk to somebody that holds a different opinion than you do.
Thanks, Heather. And I want to ask one real quick question. When we were talking prior to this panel, you talked a lot about, you said that a lot of this happens when people are not voting, such as in primaries, number one. Number two was that, what can we do as citizens to change, or to at least get our representatives to listen to us. And one thing that was really interesting that you said is, don't sign those massive petitions, that it really needs to be something much more personal. So I want to hear your thoughts on that. And then Kim, if you wanted to add to that too, as well, with respect to advocating.
So I'm gonna define what you mean by petition. So there's initiatives, there's referrals. By petitions, I'm meaning the mass emails to elected official. What happens when, as an elected official, you are receiving sort of the mass national email, sign up. Mitzi, I can't remember if we said I'm supposed to call it out or not call it out. Can I call it out?
Feel free.
So like, for example, change.org, and you feel like you want to take some agency, you're really passionate about it. So you go to a website that says, sign up here, sign the petition. As an elected official, when I received a change.org email action alert on the issue of abortion, my email would get shut down, which obviously sends a message, right? The volume sends a message. However, if I'm looking to communicate directly with my constituents so that I can understand what my constituents feel about this issue that live in my district, I do not have a name on that email. I do not have a way for me to communicate back to that person. And so a much more personal approach is more impactful. And it doesn't have to be a long email. It can be quick in the title. I'd like to talk to you about this. I'd like to share my story about this. I'd like to share data about this. Couple quick sentences and then reach out. And what's really interesting is a lot of elected officials will hold a meeting for you. They, especially with availability of Zoom, picking up the phone. These are people. These are not, this is your neighbor who may run for office, right? And may end up in Congress. Pick up the phone, call them, email them, and don't give up. Keep reaching out. I think that's really important. And if, for example, your own elected official will not respond, find one that will. So I used to say, I'm the health chair. You can adopt me across the state of Arizona if you care about this issue. These are the committees I serve on. So look for an elected official that will listen. And I will tell you, a lot of this is about politics and it's grabbing the headlines, right? So, I mean, in terms of the conversation people are having, we want to look to solve problems, and there is a path forward, I believe. I fundamentally have to believe there's a path forward here for us to address some of these absolutely real concerns we have with these decisions. And so that's the space that I'd really like to lean into.
Thank you. Kim, you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think we've spent too long relying on the courts, which are an inherently conservative institution. I think movement building is what we should be focused on right now, particularly movement building that centers reproductive justice and the work of reproductive justice organizations, and really interrogates this claim that abortion is somehow in tension with religion, because I think that's one thing that the anti-abortion movement has done very well over the course of the last 5 decades, is to really rewrite history and change the narrative such that many people now believe that it's not historically accurate. And I think we need to be having those conversations so that people understand that.
Great, thank you. We have time for maybe one question. Rochelle, do you want to go ahead and pose that from our audience, and then we'll have to move on, unfortunately.
Yes, so this is a great question. The question is, how can we codify Roe? Does the Women's Health Protection Act need to be modified before it sees success, or are we stuck here as long as the filibuster remains?
I think we probably both have the same answer to that question. I think we're stuck here as long as the filibuster remains.
Great. Well, thank you both. I know we could, again, spend so much more time on this. This was really helpful. Kim Clark and Heather Carter, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Mitzi.
Thank you, Mitzi. Thank you for doing this webinar.
Okay. And as our next panel comes on, I want to introduce Linda Goler Blount, who is the president and CEO of the Black Women's Health Imperative. There she is. And Kellie Lease Stecher, Dr. Kellie Lease Stecher, who is an OBGYN, an advocate, a founder of Patient Care Heroes, and that's how we met. And Dr. Sophia Yen, who is an adolescent medicine specialist and also CEO and co-founder of PandiaHealth.com, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Mitzi.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. Linda, let me go ahead and start with you. There's been much, made about the fact that women of color, and especially Black women, will suffer disproportionately because of this decision. Please explain what that really means.
Yeah, so this is more of what we've seen. We saw it with COVID-19 just 2 years ago. It is more of the same. Anytime there's a change in policy and practice, Black and brown women, low-income women suffer most and first. So I think it's important to know that abortion was actually legal until Reconstruction, and it became illegal because of the needs of a labor force. Obviously, chattel slavery had ended. So where we are now is we're putting the decision over what women can and cannot do with their bodies, how and when and if they have children, in the hands of the state. So as I think about this, I think about how, if I were a mother of a young daughter, how do I explain to her that these elected officials who look nothing like her have now determined that she can't be trusted to make the right decisions for her body and for her health, and they have to make the decision. So as we look at sort of abortion overall, the abortion rates declined from 2018 to 2019 by over 20%, from 900,000 down to from 2 million down to 900,000. But since 2017, they've begun to creep up because of trap laws, crisis pregnancy centers, economic insecurity. So we know roughly 1 in 5 pregnancies ends in abortion. And Black women are almost 4 times more likely to have an abortion, and low-income women more likely to have an abortion than white women and upper-income women. 39% of all abortions occur among Black women, 28% among white women, 25% among Hispanic. But the important thing to know is that the majority of women who choose abortion care already have children. The number one reason they choose to have an abortion is because they can't afford to have another child. So they are making the best economic decision and health decision for themselves. So one of the things that really concerns me is that in half the states now where women can no longer have abortion, a big chunk of Black and brown women live in those states, and a significant percentage of low-income women live in those states. So we're going to see poverty rates increase by 15 to 20%. And a few years ago, there was a study that showed that a child born into poverty has about a 4% chance of ever leaving poverty. So with this decision to control women's body and not allow women to control their bodies, we're condemning perhaps generations of children to a life of poverty. And then all of the consequences that come when you're poor: lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to education, stable housing, safe housing, good food. So then we condemn them to more chronic disease, more infections, more diseases of what we call despair, because you simply can't afford to be healthy. And I'll just end with this, that we know that in the US, every year, 50,000 Black women die due to the consequences of racial and gender discrimination. So this decision, or the reversal, simply adds to that and makes living for these women even more difficult and, frankly, less likely.
You know, the long-term impacts that you underlined are so important. And even rolling back, we now know that we know that the United States has the worst record of all the developed countries with respect to maternal child health outcomes. And it's getting worse, not better. And we know that Black women are at an increased risk as well. And Lisa Harris, who's a professor of reproductive medicine at the University of Michigan, wrote in a recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine, maternal mortality will increase because abortion is far safer than childbirth. Data from the CDC shows that the risk of dying from childbirth is 50 to 130 times greater than dying from an abortion. And demographers estimate that maternal mortality will increase by 21% under a ban, but echoing existing disparities, 13% among white and 33% among birthing Black women. And in fact, during the pandemic, maternal mortality jumped 33%, and Hispanic and Black women were most adversely affected. And so what do you see in terms of this restriction or ban with respect to those numbers?
Unfortunately, we're just going to see things get worse. I mean, it is almost unconscionable to think that we live in a country that spends much more on healthcare than the next nearest country, 70% more.
Per capita, right.
We have the kinds of health conditions and premature mortality rates that we have in this country. But we're going to see this increase. Part of what we're going to see is, I think, as Kim alluded to, providers are going to step back and be less inclined, certainly not even to take the risk of providing abortion, but anything that might be considered or confused with abortion. A woman comes in with an ectopic pregnancy. I mean, we've already seen stories where providers are saying, we're going to have to wait and let that become infected, perhaps septic even, and then provide a different kind of medical care. So providers are being put in the position of having to ask a woman to risk her life so that they don't get into trouble by providing needed abortion care.
Thank you. Kellie, do you want to step in and talk to that?
I do, because this is my lane kind of right now. So what we are seeing is really incredible throughout the country, and each state having a different set of legislation is quite honestly horrifying. We've all seen how well that worked during COVID, right? For example, there was a 10-year-old that was sexually assaulted and couldn't get abortion care in Ohio, needed to go to Indiana for care, right? So we're really seeing significant risks to our patients. It's important to keep in mind that every medical association has come out and condemned this reversal. So American Medical Association, ACOG, American College of OBGYN, all of our professional organizations is saying that this is not ethical, this is not just, this is not something that we should be participating in because it is going to lead to worse outcomes. As an OBGYN, I also see that uptick of domestic violence, right? And so who's more at risk for domestic violence than someone with an unplanned pregnancy? No one, right? So we actually see that about 20% of women in pregnancy are going to have domestic violence. So what is that going to mean? Well, that's going to probably also up the maternal mortality rate because we have individuals who are trapped into these relationships potentially they were sexually assaulted by someone who was their partner, which I know that that's even a controversial topic nowadays. People are trying to decrease the rights of women to say that a partner sexually assaulted them. But we've got these individuals who are trapped in relationships. And then what's going to happen with that? Well, then the mental health crisis is also going to become much more dire. And we also used to see more suicide because people couldn't get access to prenatal care, access to postpartum care, and so on and so forth. And so when I talk to my colleagues around the country, we're seeing significant changes in the makeup of the states as well. So, for example, I know many people who are leaving states like Georgia, Oklahoma, Missouri. And so when we have access issues to start out with, and then we pass legislation that's going to put physicians at risk and their license at risk, they're going to move to a state that is more pro-choice, like the state of Minnesota where I live, thankfully at this point. However, we are going to see more crisis and more deserts of care for people, which is also going to increase maternal mortality.
Whew. Okay. So Sophia, we're talking about pregnancy right now, and you deal with adolescents for the most part and teens, and who are on these college campuses in those different states that, Kellie talked about, the different state regulations. What are you seeing and what are your suggestions?
So, as a mother of two teenagers who will soon be applying to college, I think for those of us in states that are hospitable to women's rights and that support a person's right to bodily autonomy, one, it's really important that everybody know about plancpills.org, which hopefully will be covered later. And two, that everyone get emergency contraception and know the difference between the 4 different options. So the most effective emergency contraception is the copper IUD. And in general, not a fan of the copper IUD because really important for people who consider it more blood, more cramps. So I've been on Reddit, I've been on Quora, I've been on a bunch of different things. And people are like, so much blood, so much cramps. And I was like, did not your doctor tell you? But most likely the physician hopefully did. And they were just like, oh, it's not going to happen to me. And then it happened to them. But the copper IUD is the most effective emergency contraception. You can also use the hormonal IUD. So if me, my daughter, my friend, my patient were sexually assaulted and they wanted the lowest possible chance of being impregnated by their rapist, you go to the ER and you say, throw down a copper IUD or a hormonal IUD. The second most effective is Ella. It's a prescription-only emergency contraception. And this is my tip. What your doctor doesn't know could end you up pregnant. So I gave talks to a bunch of doctors, and many of them did not know about prescription emergency contraception. Under the Affordable Care Act, it's available with no copay, no deductible, aka free. And so please get it in advance. At Pandia Health, we write in the prescription, please give the patient the one with the farthest expiration date. This is for the future. Because if you walk in the pharmacy right now, they'll give you the one that expires this week because they're like, she's going to use it. So let's just give her the one that expires this week. And then as physicians, I tell everybody, never withhold birth control. Because if you withhold birth control, what happens? Somebody ends up pregnant. And then you have to deal with an unplanned, unwanted pregnancy and or an abortion. So if you want to prevent abortion, give people birth control. So we give them 11 refills. And they're like, wait, you're like promoting crazy wild sex. And again, if she doesn't have that refill, what happens? She ends up pregnant. So give her the refill. And then lastly, Plan B and its generics do not work. If your BMI is 26 or greater, not so good. 30 or greater definitely does not work. And 60% of this country fits in that category. So please check your BMI, body mass index. Just Google it, throw down your height or weight. And if it's 26 or greater, do the Ella, do the IUD, not the Plan B and its generics. And again, if it were my friend, my daughter, my patient, I wouldn't do the Plan B unless there was no other option. I would do the Ella or I would do the IUD. And so really important, condom drawer and Ella. And we're telling everybody double up, not on hormonal methods and not on your condom, but condom plus hormonal methods for anybody that's doing heterosexual activity. And certainly the copper IUD and hormones. But if you double up, the risk of pregnancy goes further down. And then automate your birth control. So the IUD and the implant are the best possible options. But if you can't do that, not ready for that, Pandia Health can deliver the pill, the patch, the ring to your door. If your doctor writes the prescription and you have insurance, you pay us nothing. If you want to use our doctors, it's $20 once a year to use our expert birth control doctors. And we have a special algorithm that has optimized it such that 85% of women stay on their birth control at a year because no side effects. You don't even notice. And you're like, this is great. It just comes. Whereas normally only 55% stay on it. And as a woman of color, I've made sure it's good for Asians, Blacks, and everybody to the best of my ability.
And thank you, Sophia. And we have a lot of your resources on our website. So thank you for that very good common sense information. Kellie, I want to go back to real quickly the conversation with respect to this decision, because Justice Alito referred to physicians who provide an abortion as abortionists, not as healthcare providers. And we've seen how dangerous pregnancy can be. And both Kim and Linda talked about a lot of the life-threatening issues that can happen with respect to any kind of pregnancy, unplanned or planned, to save the mother. And yet we are already hearing stories of physicians having to wait to get permission from a state entity to provide that needed health care. And at least one recent case, a woman died. So just to let folks know what kind of problems can happen during pregnancy, because again, we already heard that pregnancy can be dangerous, and it also, and it's obviously life-changing in so many ways. But again, here in America, we don't have great outcomes across the board. So, what are some of the things that might initiate a termination of a pregnancy with respect to a medical condition?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. But before I go into that, I just think we need to remind everyone that words really matter, right? So I am a OBGYN, I take care of women, I supply all of women's health care, I deliver babies, I provide abortions, I provide infertility care. I think it's extremely disheartening that a Supreme Court justice would use the word abortionist to describe someone who's gone their entire life with the sole purpose of taking care of women in a safe manner. And that's what leads to the violence and the corruption and everything else. And so I think we just all need to keep that in mind as well. So when I was in training, I was in an institution that was more conservative, right? And so the only abortion care I provided was for really dire situations. And so we heard mentioned in the first panel that sepsis is something, and that is an infection. So what happens with that? So for example, if you have a second trimester fetus, which means that it is not viable, cannot survive on its own, very sadly, even if you very much wanted this pregnancy, if you break your water early, you are more at risk for something called sepsis or septic abortion. And what happens is bacteria gets into that uterus, you can get very sick, you can go into septic shock, and you can die. And so it is our job to be able to care for you in a safe fashion. And one of the reasons why the Polish abortion legislation was so dramatic is there was a young woman who died of a septic abortion, which was kind of held up when we were arguing all of this early on. And so what happens is if a physician is told they're going to be sued, they're going to be fined, they're going to be felons, they're going to go to jail, certainly that makes a lot of people take pause. And so they're not going to act as swiftly to care for these individuals. And that's what's very concerning to me. Now, if it's me, clearly I'm not a rule follower. I'm going to perform the procedure. And if I'm a felon, I'm a felon. But that's also another way where we are found not able to vote, right? And so this whole process is so extreme that physicians are being held to a standard that's impossible. And when we talk about moral injury and burnout and everything else, which we've all faced during COVID, that is going to be compounded with this. So OBGYNs who were already at a 70% burnout rate now are likely going to be at like 98%. And that's why so many are going to be leaving, because we can't do what's in the best interest for our patients. In Missouri, for example, there was an ectopic pregnancy that people were just observing. In no way, shape, or form is an ectopic pregnancy ever going to be viable. You will never.
And just explain what an ectopic pregnancy is for those who may not
So
know.
that's a pregnancy that's outside the normal uterine cavity. So typically in the fallopian tube. It can be in other locations as well, but those are more rare. And so what happens is as that grows, it's going to rupture and it's going to cause internal bleeding. And so physicians were delaying action until we saw vital sign changes or hemoglobin dropping, meaning that there's internal bleeding for a non-viable pregnancy. So women are at risk, their safety is at risk, need for further hospitalization, need for blood transfusion, need for more emergent surgical intervention. All these things are compounded by the fact that people who are creating this policy are not healthcare providers, are not physicians, are not taking care of these women.
Thank you. And we have like 2 minutes. I want to just get this one question in because I think it's so important. According to a study published in April in Obstetrics and Gynecology, 128 of the 286 OBGYN residency programs in the United States are located in the 26 states that either had trigger laws already in place or are likely to restrict abortion. This means that roughly 45% of those programs will no longer offer training in abortion skills, which, by the way, are also, as we all know, miscarriage skills. What will be the impact?
Well, honestly, we're going to have an entire generation of physicians who are not going to be able to do full scope OBGYN. And coming out the other side of COVID, we also are seeing some deficiencies in areas because of lack of elective surgery and lack of GYN skills that we've had. And so when we see these graduates and then we force their hand into not being trained appropriately, we're handicapping an entire generation of physicians.
Which means in terms of health outcomes?
So obviously we're going to have worse health outcomes. We're going to have less safe surgery. We're going to have more people with problems with things like uterine perforation and infection and surgical complications. And that's going to lead to more adverse health effects for women. So we've created a situation where we're in a spiral that's going to affect patient safety for years to come.
All right. Well, I hate to end on that note. And there were so many other questions I wanted to ask all of you, including, I'll just throw out one more thing real quickly, is that we know that women with rheumatoid arthritis, endometriosis, and cancer are also not being able to get their drugs because they're considered abortion drugs. And so they're not being able to change to treat their diseases. And again, as you pointed out, Linda, the chronic conditions that that are impacting individuals are significant. So, and I apologize to those that we didn't get to your questions, but I want to thank this panel for your expertise, your skill, and sharing your knowledge. And hopefully you'll come back and we'll have a longer conversation.
Thanks, Mitzi.
All right. Thank you very much. Our next panel is coming on board. There's Laura Compton, who's a member of Mintz, Levin, Cohn, Barris, Glavsky, and Popeo PC. I hope I said that right. Who's also as an attorney, and Blair Hurst, who's founder and CEO of the Digital Health Review, and Stephanie Humphrey, a technology and lifestyle expert, as well as author. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Blair, we're going to start with you. You live in the digital health world. What do you see as some of the most, what do you see as the most challenging issues with respect to digital health apps and this specific issue?
So with digital health apps, I think there is a lot of confusion, and rightfully so, about which privacy and security laws apply to the information that's currently being collected. And why is this important? Because, since the early 70s, we've been operating under Roe. And during that time, the amount of information that's being collected on all of us in the digital space has exponentially increased. as has the value of the data that is being collected on all of us. So we're now entering into this new phase where this information can now be used against providers and individuals in states where abortion is criminalized. And we've heard that's going to be quite a few states. So really just awareness of what laws apply and how that plays out when it comes to collection of information is going to be critical.
And Blair, you again focus on digital health apps, and you know the founders of these apps and these companies. What are some of the challenges that they're seeing with respect to trying to manage their data privacy, their clients' data privacy?
Well, it's fairly multiple. A lot of these companies, to begin with, have been struggling with just the basic fact of getting trust from consumers. That's the main issue around a lot of the premise of having digital health apps work. If we can gain trust, if we can treat you remotely, we'll be able to deliver better access to care and at a cheaper cost. So there's benefits there. So that's the main issue that we had to overcome. And I think Roe v. Wade is going to erode some of that trust as well, because now they're starting over because folks are asking, what data are you collecting? Where are you sending it to? And these are questions that consumers need to ask of these companies.
Right. I think, I'm sorry.
They need to understand, like, is this company HIPAA compliant? Who are they partnering with? What data are they collecting it? Are they aggregating it at an appropriate level that it can't be traced back to me? These are questions that consumers haven't had to worry about before, that they're asking now, and that the digital health companies are going to have to start answering.
And again, you know, Laura, I met you through a webinar that, and my big aha moment was that these apps are do not necessarily have to be HIPAA compliant. So explain what HIPAA compliance is and why that's important in this situation.
Okay, so it is a common misconception that HIPAA, which has privacy and security requirements that are applicable to protected health information, applies to all of the health-related information that's out there in the digital world, and that's simply just not the case. HIPAA applies to covered entities and business associates, which are two defined terms. Covered entities include health plans and health insurance, healthcare providers that are engaging in HIPAA-covered transactions, and basically what that means is they're involved with health insurance. So if you have somebody that's cash pay, unless they're doing, you know, something that would otherwise trigger HIPAA, they may not be covered by HIPAA either as a cash pay entity. And healthcare clearinghouses are the last ones, and those are essentially the switches that enable communications between the plans and the providers. Those entities may contract with vendors and other service providers that involve protected health information. And if those vendors are using and disclosing that information in connection with the services they provide, they're business associates and subject to the security rules and applicable portions of the privacy rule that relate to their services. So how this plays out, just to give an example, is, you know, if you have a hospital system that decides it's going to build an app that's a tool, and they engage a vendor to help them do that and host the information, you know, that vendor would be covered by HIPAA because PHI is involved in the service. But if a company that isn't a covered entity, that's just, you know, a tech company, for example, that has a great idea on wellness, you know, that entity could build the same app, put it out there for consumers to use, and that company would not be subject to HIPAA because there's no covered entity anywhere.
And even if it is subject to HIPAA, you made the point that it's not an ironclad shield.
Correct. So, you know, I think that's really what I am aiming to educate people about today is, you know, one, HIPAA may not always apply, and two, even if it does, that's not an absolute shield to protect information that's out there, particularly when it comes to law enforcement. So, you know, HHS has come out and said, you know, as a healthcare provider, you can't go volunteer information to law enforcement if it's not required by law. But there are plenty of instances in which it would be required by law. for a healthcare provider or other entity subject to HIPAA to provide information. And classic examples of that include valid court orders, court-ordered search warrants, criminal subpoenas, grand jury subpoenas, and a whole host of other things. Responding to certain administrative requests like medical board, that is permissible. Responding to identifying or locating suspects, limited amounts of information can be disclosed on for those purposes. Identifying or apprehending individuals who have admitted participation in a violent crime.
And if abortion is considered a violent crime, that would go under that.
Yeah, so we've really got to watch, what are the other laws that are happening in these states, because it really does make a big difference. Here's another one: child abuse or neglect reporting. If the state comes out and decides, abortion must be reported, that's a required by law reporting.
Excuse me for interrupting, but going to your point, again, when we talked earlier before the panel, Blair brought up the issue about that individuals, to your point, that are seeking mental health services. Mental health professionals are mandated to report an issue about if someone's going to be a harm to themselves or others. Blair, you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there has been a proliferation of mental health apps, as we all know, in advocacy for mental health through telemedicine and telehealth. And so how that is currently been distributed now comes into question what you can actually talk to with your mental health provider, what you can disclose about yourself and your health. So, as was mentioned earlier, the mental health crisis is probably going to see an increase because folks are going to start retreating back because there's going to be a lack of trust in the system again.
And also with respect to, reporting on people, Stephanie, you brought up the whole issue about data brokers. What data are they brokering and who are their customers?
They are brokering whatever they can collect. Data brokers do just that. They sell data, mostly sourced from public records on the internet, so publicly available information, but they also purchase information from credit card companies, from retailers, from anyone selling basically. But then there is also user provided data. We volunteer enormous amounts of our own data across platforms, all across the internet. So that creates this digital footprint that is huge, that gives people a lot of information and data points to make some very specific identifications of consumer behavior on the internet, and even all the way down to the individual level. So they're selling the data. There was a Vice article recently where they were able to buy the data of I think 600 different Planned Parenthoods across the country. They were able to buy the location data for about $160. So over the course of the week's worth of data that they had, they were able to tell who had come to that facility, how long they stayed, where they went afterwards. And this is, again, just based off of publicly available information and information that our phones are sort of sourcing from us without our knowledge, and information that we're giving away as well. So it really is incumbent upon all of us, I think, to really reconsider our digital footprints in their entirety and the type of information that we're putting out there.
Absolutely. I want to get back to some very concrete examples in just a moment. You talked about Planned Parenthood, and I just want to make the point that a lot of times when women are looking for abortions, they've been diverted to these, quote, crisis clinics that look a lot like abortion clinics, but are in fact not such. They're just the opposite. And again, Laura, you educated me that those are not HIPAA protected, even though everybody has a white coat on and they look very clinical. But yet again, Planned Parenthood are legitimate medical practices, but yet you're saying again, Stephanie, that information can still be, with or without HIPAA, can still be discovered. And I also want to go back to the point that, and you all can, if somebody also wants to comment, that app privacy policies it's my understanding that, and again, because I probably haven't read them and I've just signed the I agree, like everybody else, that it does say in the fine print that if they are subpoenaed, they have to give up that information. Is that what you were speaking to, Laura?
So, regardless of if you're a covered subject to HIPAA or not, there are certain processes in which, particularly for criminal purposes, companies are going to be asked to provide this data and compelled to provide the data. So, if you get a court order, there are certain ways you can try to respond to that, but ultimately, failing to comply with a court order, you're going to be held in contempt. And, depending on the circumstances, there's the possibility that, you're being obstructionist and you're going to come up with an obstruction of justice type charge. So, I'm not a criminal attorney, so I'll let others, comment more on that point. But, just based on, in my experience representing healthcare providers, these are the types of things that they run into on a regular basis. And for those that are not subject to HIPAA, they even have most of the time less of a shield to be able to say, we can't provide you with this information.
Sure.
And if I could just jump in there, Mitzi, these platforms, the Googles and the social media platforms of the world, they're not really inclined to fight law enforcement requests for information. I think it's greater than it's well above 50% as far as how many of law enforcement requests they grant on a regular basis. They've put new language in some of their terms of service that they will scrutinize the request to make sure that it's reasonable and fair and all the rest of that stuff. But again, it's greater than 50%. And there was a recent case where Facebook was actually scammed by someone pretending to be law enforcement that was able to make a request for data and get it. So the idea that the companies themselves are going to be these staunch defenders of justice with our personal information, I think is a little bit naive to believe at this point anyway.
Now, didn't Google just come out with a statement, though, that they were going to protect
They did. I know where you're going already. So Google
Google
has said that they would delete sensitive location data shortly after they collect it, which means location data for abortion clinics, for domestic violence shelters, for weight loss clinics, other types of sensitive location information. But they have not specified what that short amount of time is after they collect it. It could be any particular length of time, and law enforcement can certainly subpoena them before they delete it. Number two, if it's sensitive, why are you collecting it in the first place? Is the better question to be asking. And number three, they're not going to be deleting search histories, which have been historically used in criminal cases like this, where they found someone searching for abortion pills or locations of clinics or things like that. So there's still a ton of data that they're going to keep, and they're still keeping this data. They just won't keep it for as long as they keep the rest of it.
Right. And I just want to underline that there was actually at least one case where search information was used to show intention to obtain an abortion in a state that banned abortion. And that was used to prosecute a woman. So what that underlines what you're saying in terms of the challenges.
To that, for whatever that Google intention was or will be, I think even just disclosing that is a step in the right direction, because that is what we need to start asking ourselves. If we know what the laws are, what the rules have been, how are we building up our defenses? And then letting folks know what that is so that we can all work together. Because there is and has been some benefit of collecting this data for a variety of reasons that have been public health measures, for example, or health safety measures. So while it has been very invasive, there's some benefit there. We don't want to stymie ourselves in this next step post Roe v. Wade decision, so that we don't continue doing that research and investment into women's health, because everyone is afraid and hasn't strategized around how we can work around this through data sharing, which, as we all know, is basically the lifeblood of the healthcare industry right now. But that was the last point that I just want to add in there.
No, I think that's a really good point. And your audio is a little hard. So for people that couldn't quite get that, you're really talking about data collection, and so much, especially in women's health, where we don't have a lot of research and we have so many knowledge gaps. A lot of these apps are, tracking and providing that data that we haven't had before, and actually impacting on clinical treatments and clinical knowledge. And so that's a really good point in terms of the balance with respect to, is that going to get shut down as well? Is that an indirect implication as well with respect to women's health? So thank you for making that point. You talked also, Stephanie, a little bit about the role of social media. Talk a little bit more about what details that you were considering.
I think social media can play a huge role, and I think right now they're starting to look at what they call data minimization principles. So that's only collecting the data that's absolutely necessary, and not storing it on your platform or in your servers for an extended period of time. So if we can even get that ball rolling, I think we will be sort of ahead of the game. But they're also not doing a lot, or they're actually, I feel like, rolling back some of the sort of First Amendment issues around this whole idea, because Facebook and Instagram have recently deleted a lot of content around people putting stuff out there about how to get abortion pills, where to get it, people offering to purchase abortion pills for other women in other states and send it to them. They've been deleting all of that content across the board very, very quickly, I might add, while they leave information up about how to buy a gun or how to buy weed or how to buy something else, up indefinitely. So there's been a very concerted effort. It appears that there's been a very concerted effort to sort of suppress a lot of information around the topic of abortion and Roe v. Wade across social media platforms. So they're going to have to get a little bit more clear on what their policy is around this issue and enforce it unilaterally across all of those instances.
Thank you. Well, in the last couple of minutes that we have, I promised that we'd have some very specific suggestions. So I'm going to start with you, Stephanie, and then leave it up to Blair and Laura to also contribute.
So I would say consider your digital footprint. Honestly, if you are concerned about this kind of thing, turn off the Find My feature on your phone, turn off your location data, use a VPN if you can, or private browsing when searching. VPN is virtual private network. When searching, always ask the app not to track. We get that little pop-up on iPhones now. I'm not sure if Android phones do it, but there's a little pop-up when you download an app. It asks you if you want to track it. Definitely do not let it track it. Maybe you need a second phone number through Google Voice or a burner phone if you're going to be communicating with clinics and different people like that. Lock your phone and don't enable the Face ID or the Touch ID if you plan to be in any sort of protest where there is the possibility that you may be arrested. You could be compelled to just, they can put the phone in front of your face and you can show your face to unlock your phone. So disable those features and pay in cash. Pay in cash if you can, or with gift cards.
Great, thank you. Blair, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I would say do all the things that Stephanie just advised. That's a very thorough list. I had some of mine, so I'm not going to repeat. But if you are using digital health apps right now to take care of your health or a family member that lives with you or doesn't live with you, and you need that to continue with your health care, I would say talk to that specific company. Reach out to them for specific steps that they're going to be doing to protect your data, protect your health, and get reassured. And if you're not happy with it, search for alternatives. So I do have on Digital Health Review a resource for folks to figure out what those companies are. So you can feel free to go there. But I would suggest trying to use digital health apps as much as possible still in that like that.
Great, thank you. And we will put that resource on the website as well. And I also want to make the point, again, learning from you all, that it's not just the reproductive health apps that are, providing information, but even something as simple as a migraine app or something that even collects, adjacently reproductive health information could be a source of that data. Laura, we'll end with you.
All fantastic recommendations, and I agree with all of them. The one thing I didn't get a chance to mention much, but I do want to mention now is just the security of information. So, for those out there who are collecting data that could be used, we know there may be rules that prevent them from disclosing certain information depending on the circumstances, but we have states that are enacting laws that are basically incentivizing people to go out and get their hands on this type of information, for example, in Texas. So, regardless of who you are, and I know we have a lot of different stakeholders here, security has always been important for multiple reasons, but now there's yet another consideration for why it is so important to think about security of the information that you're collecting and transmitting.
Great, thank you. And thank you all so much for your time and your expertise. This was a really enlightening conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, this is our final panel. We've moved right along. I want to thank everybody for keeping on point. Our last panel is comprised of Joelle Abramowitz, Dr. Joelle Abramowitz, who is an economist at the University of Michigan, Cindy Adam, who's a registered nurse practitioner and co-founder and CEO of Choice, which we'll tell you about in just a moment, and Delphine O'Rourke, who's a partner at Goodwin and a women's health and wellness healthcare, in women's health and healthcare, as well as a healthcare adjunct professor at Columbia Law School. Thank you all very much for being here today. So, Joelle, I'm going to start with you because you have the big picture, and I think it's really an impactful one as well. During the consideration of Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization, during that consideration, originally, a group of 150 plus economists signed on to an amicus brief against the abortion ban, in which they outlined decades of research on the economic impact of unwanted pregnancies related to abortion bans. You were one of those economists that signed on. Could you tell us about those economic implications that you were speaking about?
Absolutely. So to give some background about why this brief exists at all, Mississippi argued, and I'll quote this, that there was no reason to believe that abortion access has shaped the ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation. And really, the reason for this brief is that that's not what we've seen from, decades of economic research. And so this research has looked at the effects of policies providing access to abortion, both in the pre-Roe era, but also more recently in more recent decades. And what we've seen, really universally is that access to abortion enables people to pursue many different domains that are so important to contributing to the economic and social life of our nation. That includes being able to get education. It includes being able to progress in careers and pursue more prestigious careers. It includes, we found that women that have less access to abortion are more likely to be in bankruptcy and behind on their bills. So in all these different ways, we're seeing these really problematic outcomes of not having access to abortion. And we see that very clearly in this large literature.
Right. And, we were talking about that in one of the earlier panels. Linda Blount made the point of saying that this is really not just about the generation of women who may have to drop out of school or not go back to work, but also their children also continuing in poverty.
Absolutely. Because, if we see someone who is, more likely to be in bankruptcy because they had a pregnancy that and a child that they couldn't support, then certainly that's going to affect the environment that child is growing up in. And we also heard earlier, most women that have abortions already have children. And we think about the other family members in those households, the other children and other adults who are now in worse economic circumstances and what growing up in those circumstances, means for them, and ultimately their own economic circumstances later in life.
And how does that impact GDP and the larger economic picture?
When we think about, people being able to pursue their potentials, right? And we to have workers being able to, work in the kinds of jobs that we need them to work in the economy, that they're less able to do that. Certainly, just less able to participate fully. And it really, decreases our ability overall as a country to progress.
And along with that, healthcare costs could go up. And I'll just, I referred to Dr. Lisa Harris before, and I'll just quote her again. Neonatal ICUs and later pediatricians will see more babies, including some with substantial medical needs in infancy and beyond, whose parents might have ended their pregnancy after receiving fetal anatomical or genetic diagnoses, mention the risk to their children. Those who may be carried to term with those deformities will need complex medical care and long-term support. So what does that mean to our healthcare cost, and then also to the larger economic picture?
Right.
And is
So
that valid? Is what she said valid?
I think it's absolutely valid. And we would see, really increases in costs to everyone in the system, right? We're going to see increases in costs for people, the pregnant women and the families of that now have children that have greater needs. Certainly, those individuals will be very impacted by the costs related to those. But we'll also see greater costs borne by insurance, which are then passed on to other, those insured by that insurance. And for people on Medicaid or that don't have insurance, we're going to see higher taxes, and those costs will be borne by taxpayers, and also higher costs from hospitals for uncompensated care. So, across the board, we're really going to see that all of us are going to bear costs related to these. And I also just want to emphasize, when we think about these more complicated pregnancies, they're also more risky pregnancies, right? And as was mentioned earlier, that we'll likely see greater maternal mortality just from the fact that we have these more risky pregnancies, in addition to all the other factors that were mentioned earlier. And when we think about our already overburdened healthcare system, just seeing, these costs all across the board, both in terms of economic costs, but also, lives.
Sure. I'll just shift a little bit, and then I'm going to get our other panelists in on this conversation as well. But we've also seen that since the decision was made, many larger companies have made their own announcements about how they're going to respond in support of their employees. It's not an easy decision because there's so many considerations, I would think, that have to go into making policies with respect to insurance, financial support, even legal liability. Can you talk a little bit about what's maybe going through the mind and some of those executives' minds?
For sure. So, if you're a company, you can think about, just in general, what are benefits that I could offer? Could I cover abortion and my employer provided insurance? And certainly now the question of, well, is abortion legal in my state? What if I have employees that work across different states with different legal environments and the implications of that? So there are certainly, big and complicated legal questions there. There are certainly other ways to offer these benefits. So it could be through insurance coverage. It could also be through, as we've seen a lot of employers mention, about covering transportation costs. In addition, employers can also cover leave, for employees to be able to go and pursue this care. But I think, what's really important to think about as employers offer this, right, is both, the legal intricacies of offering these in their particular state, but also how they do it in a thoughtful way to respect their employees and their employees' privacy.
Thank you. Delphine, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, sure, it's a complex issue, and we have, employers across the country are grappling with what is the support, what position do they want to take on covering not just abortion, but women's health services overall. There's a prior panelist who mentioned IVF. If that's no longer as accessible, what about a plan B? What about contraceptives? And I mean, everything from, aiding and abetting. Are the employers going to be responsible if they are reimbursing for travel, childcare expenses? There's no one answer, obviously also depends on your insurance plan and how you structure it. But this is, further demonstration that the decision isn't just impacting abortion. It is having a ripple effect across our economy. Call yesterday with folks in the UK who are also trying to figure out how it's going to impact businesses there. So the ripple effect is significant.
Absolutely. And speaking of businesses, you work with a lot of women's health businesses and startups. And what are the implications for some of your companies that you're working with?
Thank you, Mitzi, and also thank you to the other panelists. I mean, this conversation has been just fantastic, and to hear different angles, and this interdisciplinary approach is really unique. So I represent founders, I represent established companies and investors, and we knew the decision was coming. We knew. We anticipated, no one knew for sure because of the leaked decision. But sometimes, like a lot of things in life, you deny, you're in denial until it actually happens and it really hits you. For women founders and, again, established companies and investors, the impact is obviously directly on abortion, but much broader than that. And what I really want us to try to keep focus on is there has been tremendous amount of innovation and investment in the women's health and wellness industry. I think what Roe is showing and shining a light on, much like COVID, are the issues that were already there. We had gender inequities, we had racial inequities in our healthcare system. Women's health has been underfunded, ignored for years and years, and we have been receiving care that is substandard in a lot of parts of the country. So this is shining a light not just on abortion care, but also overall women's health. And I think that's what we're going to start seeing more of is, what about other areas? What about maternal health we talk about? What about fertility? What about the costs of fertility? So really that it is having an impact across the spectrum. We talked about privacy. Yes, it's apps, but a lot of, it's not just apps that collect information. You go to the dentist, you get x-rays, they ask you if you're pregnant. There's so many data points within our system that ask for your pregnancy information. So as far as overall trends, in addition to the overall ripple effect, and I think we need to just keep on saying, one of the unintended byproducts that we need to make sure that we keep sight of is, we don't want women's health to be considered a risky investment. Women's health has been seen as risky by investors, and no money, no mission. So if the post-Roe world creates an impression that women's health is really risky, we're going to see a downside in investment. There are parts of this that are risky. There are also a lot of parts. Menopause is not a risky area, yet it's a white space. So to focus on, we need to continue our focus on all areas of women's health. Another area, and I think this is where we could all contribute, is misinformation. I mean, there's so much swirl. I mean, you saw on Twitter, the dump your period app, your fertility tracking app, these sort of reactionary responses. Those are going to put companies out of business. And sometimes, maybe they couldn't protect the privacy. But there's just a lot of misinformation, and I think women will suffer from that misinformation. So anything we can do collectively, like this webinar, to start separating the fact from fiction.
Thank you. Those are really good points. Cindy, we invited you on this panel because your work intersects actually almost all of the panels. So thank you for joining this one. You are one of those women's health companies that Delphine's talking about, and I'll let you explain what you do. And I just wonder, what kinds of issues are you resonating with respect to this discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Mitzi. I'm here. I'm a nurse practitioner. I'm also one of the co-founders of Choice. We are a sexual and reproductive health, which of course includes abortion care, telehealth clinic. And of course, this ruling, when we think about it in terms of women's healthcare and women's businesses, obviously this decision to reverse a hard-fought constitutional right to abortion care is devastating, to say the least. However, even before Roe was overturned, as Linda spoke to in the first panel, many states and communities already faced very limited access to care due to trap laws. And while many people who had to travel for abortion care historically did so to receive surgical abortion care, as restrictions grow, we're now seeing an increase in travel for medication abortion for both in-clinic care as well as for telehealth. And so while now there will be additional states that will ban or severely limit this care, affecting brick and mortar clinics and telehealth providers like myself alike, there's also many states which are enacting protections and expanding access, which is a bright light in this time. And Choice, for example, we will continue to expand to every state where we can safely and legally provide care, with the goal of being in all of those states by the end of next year. And there's a lot of other really great organizations that are growing and connecting folks to care, such as PlanCpills.org, I Need an A. I Need an A is also a great resource for practical support, abortion funds, travel, etc. Abortionfinder.org, all really important resources for finding legitimate care, not CPCs as we discussed, for in-clinic and telehealth. And
CPCs being?
Crisis pregnancy centers.
Which are not abortion providers.
Which are not abortion providers. They make their websites look like they might offer abortion care or options counseling. They offer free ultrasounds, pregnancy tests, even sometimes formula, things that people really need, but do not offer true unbiased care or counseling.
And just take a moment briefly and explain what your company does.
So we provide sexual and reproductive health care, including abortion care, online. So what that means is that our focus is using our evidence-based protocols to evaluate a patient's medical history and their ability to receive care at home. For abortion care specifically, we can look at a person's, for example, if you know the first day of your last menstrual period and you're sure of that date, we can very accurately determine the gestational age, also known as how many weeks you are along in pregnancy, without having to have an ultrasound. We can ask questions about a person's history, about anemia, current or past symptoms, review their current medications and things like that. And in many cases, people do not need to have lab work or in-person visit in order to receive care. So they can receive their pills by mail. We work with our partner pharmacy, Honeybee Health, and we can check in with them. It's very clinically supported abortion care at home throughout the process, but it's much more discreet. It's very safe, and it's another option for people who prefer to receive this care this way, or who unfortunately out of necessity, due to the decreased capacity, many in-clinic providers will face out of necessity, really.
And with respect to some of the questions that we were talking about earlier with privacy, how do you deal with your clients' privacy?
Yeah, those are great questions. Really appreciated what all the panelists said. Choice, like all healthcare providers, we are bound by federal HIPAA and state laws when it comes to patient health information, or PHI. We, for example, leverage services like Accountable, which is a HIPAA compliance management software and team to ensure compliance. Furthermore, we do not now or ever plan to sell your PHI, and people should always review the privacy policy of the site they're visiting, as was discussed. We at Choice, we look at current security best practices and trends within the broader internet community. So, for example, places like banks or financial institutions, they've really been at the forefront of online security, and to a degree, privacy as well. And so our CTO and our team uses lessons learned from these entities to help bolster our online platform.
That's a really interesting point that we didn't talk about, and that is the responsibility of the companies themselves to really protect their data, if you will, from anybody trying to hack or break into it. Mm-hmm. We only have a couple more minutes, so I only have a couple more questions, and these are a little bit random, but I want to make sure, Delphine, that I asked you about innovation by necessity, and what does that mean?
Oh, thanks for the question. So I think that's part of what I was referring to is, there's been such innovation in the women's health and wellness space, and sometimes you do need to innovate by necessity. This obviously is not the outcome that anybody who's on sort of, I don't want to say pro-choice side because we just discussed how that's become a dichotomy. But I wish we weren't having this conversation. I wish we were focusing on, how do we make sure that uterine fibroids are treated differently? How do we, again, I get back to menopause, incontinence. I mean, there are areas where we've seen so much innovation, and sometimes you do need to innovate by necessity. So around access issues, we know, even interstate shipping of contraceptives, of medicated abortion. There's concern that might be prohibited. So what are other ways to develop access? We have really smart minds focused on women's health across the board. Access was an issue before. Access is an issue for maternal health. We have maternal health deserts across the country. So this is really a call to action to innovate. We're angry, okay? People are frustrated. Come up with new ideas. Let's support each other in finding new ways. Women are very, not just women, but women are very creative. We saw this during COVID. We're resilient, and we saw, for example, the expansion of telemedicine out of necessity. What else can we come up with and support each other in this journey? Because it's going to impact mental health services. It's going to impact, if you tell your telecounselor, for example, that you're, anxious because you're going to have an abortion, those files are arguably discoverable. It's going to have so many different impacts that I think forum like this, or reach out to us if you, would like to chat further. This is really a time that we need to triple down on innovation.
Great, thank you. And Joelle, Delphine's points are well taken, and we basically have, with respect to, you actually had some answers that I thought was really interesting as well. I'll end up with this question. You found that, and this may sound random, but I'll bring it together in just a moment, that, we had the answer, if you will, to reducing the numbers of abortion. And in fact, as I think Linda Blount had pointed out, that we actually saw a decline in abortions. And you connected that to the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and the coverage of contraception. So even just a common sense, initiative ended up really making a big difference. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so in my research, I looked at how getting additional health insurance access through the Affordable Care Act's dependent coverage mandate for young adults affected both abortions and contraceptive use. And what I found there is that when individuals had more access to health insurance, that they could shift the types of contraceptives that they use. So overall, contraceptive use didn't change, but we did see a change from less effective, but also cheaper methods like condoms to more effective methods that are also more expensive and generally covered by insurance like IUDs and implants and things like that. And coincident with that, we also saw this decrease in the abortion rate. And so I think that really tells us that, people don't seek out to have an abortion, right? And, when they have options, and when they can afford those options, that they will seek them out.
Great. Well, all of you on this panel have provided, options in terms of ways to address this issue. So thank you very much for coming on today. It's all the time we have left for this panel. Again, I could speak with you all for so much longer, and hopefully we'll get another chance to do that. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that we did a kind of a whirlwind. And I thank all my panelists for really, again, giving us such great information. And I want to thank everybody here who attended and asked questions. If we didn't get to them, hopefully maybe we can get to them in the forums. And I know that some folks were writing those answers, so hopefully you got those answers as well. We will be following up with a newsletter and an email. We have resources on our website that will continue to be growing. We'll also be repurposing this on our podcast, if you will, and hopefully going even into more depth on some of the episodes. Please do check out all of our speakers, and we invite you to join our community at Beyond the Paper Gown. And again, this is just, again, the first contents of your earthquake kit, and hopefully we can add to it. And hopefully this will have given you the information that you needed. So thanks again for joining us.